The circular saw has always been one of the most popular cutting tools in the construction and DIY industry. But if you're having trouble with your cuts wandering, or the edges splintering, or the blade binds halfway through, it's normally not the saw. I'm going to show you 9 of the best tips I've learned from over 40 years of experience in the construction industry that'll take your saw cuts from this to this. So if your cuts are looking bad, one or all of these 9 tips will absolutely transform your cuts using a circular saw. So let's get started. So tip number 1 is setting the blade depth correctly. Most people set their blade too deep. When you bury the blade deep below the board, you increase tear out, you strain the motor, and you raise the risk of kickback. You only need about 1 tooth below the material, or about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. And that's it. And here's an easy way to do that. Instead of guessing or trying to tilt the saw up to the 1/8 or 1/4 inch depth, just take the board you're going to be cutting, lay it on something flat, and then take 1/8 or 1/4 inch piece of wood and lay it on top of that. Make sure your saw is unplugged or the battery is removed, and then put the saw on the 2 boards and then loosen the depth lever. That will allow the blade to touch the very bottom, making sure it's on a high tooth, and then lock the depth lever down and you're done. No more guessing or trying to measure. When you set it shallow, it cuts smoother and it cuts safer. And it's easier to control. And you can make minor adjustments to keep your saw cutting straight without it binding. Now here's something that most people don't think about when they start cutting, and that brings us to tip number 2. And tip number 2 is don't start your cut too close to the board. Never start with the blade touching the wood. Pull the saw back about 1/2 inch, let it reach full speed, then ease into the cut. If you start your blade already in the wood, especially with a lighter cordless saw, it can grab and it can shift slightly. That small movement throws off your entire cut. So a smooth start and a straight finish. Now, once you're moving, here's where people drift off the line, and that takes us to tip number 3. Tip number 3, a straight cut's a combination of things. It's not just watching the blade. You watch the blade, you check the front notch, and you look a few inches ahead of the blade on your line. It might seem overwhelming at first, but the more you practice those 3 things, the easier and more natural it'll become. And if you're cutting 2x material, like a 2x4 or 2x6, keep the front of the shoe parallel with the edge of the board. If that front edge stays even, your cut stays straighter. Also, keep the large part of the plate on the wood. This will keep it more stable, safer, and it'll keep your cuts at a 90-degree angle. If you're getting value from this already, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I post practical DIY and tool videos like this every week. No fluff, just works. Now, let's make straight cuts easier with tip number 4. And tip number 4 is to use a 12-inch speed square. If you're using a speed square as a guide, use the 12-inch one. The 6-inch one will help, but it's got a short area in order to hold the plate or the shoe of your saw. So with a 12-inch speed square, there's more surface area, which means more control. So put the tip on the top side of the board, so more of the square hangs toward you. That gives you a straighter start. And if you're making a lot of cuts, I like to put a small strip of no-slip tape along the top edge so it doesn't slip. See the difference it makes? It comes in long rolls, but you can use it for a lot of things, like put it on PVC pipe or some wooden dowel to make a nice sanding stick for curves or circles. Now, this takes us to tip number 5. And tip number 5 is to make your guide longer. Now, if you're using a straight edge guide like this one, I'll show you how to make it more effective. Now, most saws come with one of these, but if not, you can order one as long as you have these slots on your saw. They work pretty good as is, but if your guide feels short, just extend it. Now, yours might have holes in it, but if it doesn't have holes in it, just drill 2 holes about 1/2 inch from the edge, and then screw a straight piece of wood to it. A longer guide will help you start out straighter, and it won't pivot so you can get straighter cuts. So you don't need an expensive track saw to get professional results. And I'll put links to the tools and products that I use in the description. But if you're watching on a TV, you can scan the QR code right here on the screen and it'll take you right to my Amazon storefront where I keep a list of all these tools and products. Now let's talk about clean edges, and that takes us to tip number 6. And tip number 6 is using painter's tape. Now, not just any painter's tape for cleaner cuts. For plywood cuts, you'll see a lot of people recommend that you should cut or score the plywood to get a smoother cut. But as you can see, one thing is the danger of slipping off with the knife and cutting yourself. Plus, only one side comes out clean if you stay on the line. So this is what I prefer, is to use painter's tape. But not just any painter's tape. I like the green frog tape instead of using the blue painter's tape. It's smoother, as you can see here, so it adheres better and it helps reduce splintering along the cut line. And you don't have to press it down as hard, and the cut edge comes out cleaner. Just look at the difference of the cut between blue tape, green tape, and no tape. Just a small detail, but a noticeable improvement. Now let's go to tip number 7, and that's working with large pieces like plywood. So tip number 7 is support the entire sheet when you're cutting. When you're cutting large sheets or long boards, don't just support the ends. I prefer a table with foam board on it because it has the best support. And you can also lay the foam boards on the ground and then put your plywood on top of that, which is really stable. But if you're using sawhorses, lay 2 or 3 2x4s flat, and then put your foam board on top of that, and then your sheet of plywood on it. And that'll support the whole thing. That prevents the kerf from closing and binding the blade, because binding is one of the main causes of kickback, which can be very dangerous. You can also use one of these. It's called a saw buddy. It keeps the two pieces together, and there's this little piece of metal that stops the boards from closing tight. Another thing is never let your board drop off as you finish the cut. This is a sure way of splintering or cracking a board. Full support makes a huge difference. Now, this takes us up to tip number 8, and let's talk about the blade. Tip number 8, your blade matters. If you're getting a lot of splintering on your cuts and you're using tape, then the first thing you should check isn't your technique, it's your blade. Before you do anything, unplug the saw or remove the battery. Then let's take a close look at the teeth. It's not uncommon for a tooth to get chipped or even break off. And if that happens, you're going to see a lot more splintering and rough edges when you cut. Next, check to see if the blade's sharp. Run your finger or your thumb lightly along the cutting edge of each tooth. You're not pressing down hard, you're just feeling to see if that edge is still sharp. If it feels rounded or smooth instead of nice and sharp, the blade's getting dull. A dull blade doesn't just splinter the wood. It can also cause burning along the cut because it's rubbing more than it's cutting. Also, if your blade looks discolored or badly worn, lay it flat on a board or a surface to make sure it's flat and it hasn't warped. Now, let me talk about tooth count for a minute. Since I do a lot of finish work, I prefer using a 40 or a 60 tooth blade most of the time. An 18 or 24 tooth blade is great for rough framing and fast cuts, but it's more aggressive and it tends to leave a rough edge. So a 40 tooth blade gives you a nice balance. It's versatile, it works well for both ripping and cross cutting, and it gives a cleaner finish without sacrificing too much cutting speed. For general construction and DIY work, a 40 tooth blade is a very solid choice. So sometimes the problem isn't how you're cutting, it's what you're cutting with. And finally, this takes us to tip number 9. And tip number 9 is respect your tool. Whether you're using a large wormdrivesaw like this one that I often use, or a smaller cordless saw, wear personal protection equipment and don't get careless. Both saws can hurt you really bad if you start doing unsafe practices. So wear eye protection, hearing protection, and keep your body slightly offset from directly behind the saw. And never adjust a cordless saw or a corded saw unless the power is unhooked from both of them. A circular saw is incredibly useful, but it demands respect. So a straight cut isn't one secret trick. If you start using these 9 tips, then your cuts will begin changing from bad, crooked, amateur-looking cuts to safe, professional-looking cuts that you can be proud of. If this helped you, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs better cuts. And leave a comment down below. What's your favorite circular saw tip? I still learn new things after 40 years. So thanks for watching, you take care, and God bless.